So in this video, I am going to try to illustrate to you the difference of use cases of VOS 1.5's load balancing feature and NAT64. Two use cases that I am going to try to illustrate. Both of them are going to be V6 to V4, V4 to V4, and how and when to use it. Obviously, when you're doing load balancing, you are most likely going to be using web servers on the back end. So V6 client and V4 web servers. This is going to be done without NAT64. So then the load balancing will let you do that. And then the second use case will delete load balancing, and we're going to configure NAT64 so that the V6 client can talk to V4 on SSH as well as web servers, except it's not going to be load balances. It's not going to be load balanced. It's going to be direct hit to these web servers. Okay. So in my setup here, we got a V6 only Ubuntu client with this IPv6 address and a puppy V4 only client configured and talking to the VOS Ethernet 0, which is configured with dual stack IP addressing, IPv6 1:1:111/64 and IPv4 is 1111/24. The loopback on VOS 1.4 is an IPv6 address that he's going to be sending the request to, because the load balancers are going to be listening on that. On the back end, we have this two web servers connected to these two segments, 12 and 13. VOS Ethernet 1 is configured with two addresses for NAT64 to communicate or send as a source, and the V4 is configured here with web server 2, VOS 2 with web server, VOS 3 with web server listening on their loopback addresses 2222 and 3333. Okay? A lot of information. Try to take it slow. First scenario, use case 1, load balancing. We'll try to demo this part first. I've got my VOS 1.5 here configured with load balancing. I'll go over the configs. I've already put two other videos mixed together, so I wanted to make sure that I spell out the differences of these two features and how they could be used. All right, and then I do not have NAT right now. So there is no NAT. So only load balancing is configured. Two backend servers are configured, 222.333 as I showed you in the diagram. 222.333 are the backend servers. Then the service, I'm going to be using the web services for, this is the TCP, which is going to be for SSH, but for HTTP, I've got this service. So HTTP service is backend connecting to the backend servers, listening on the loopback address 1111, or not, this is not the loopback, this is the primary address of this interface. But for IPv6, I'm listening on this guy. Mode is HTTP port 80. So that's the first load balancing scenario we're going to use with load balancing only configured. This one is also configured with TCP. TCP will let you do SSH. And I will also demonstrate that how we can do SSH. But SSH is, remember, it's going to do a host check. I'm just going to try to illustrate this. You won't use SSH with load balancing. But just to illustrate that it's load balancing SSH or TCP, I'm going to ignore the host key check here. Okay. So let's go into it and hit our first web server. My connectivity to my V6 is there. Now let's go hit the try to move this out of the way so that it's more clear. So when I hit the web server at 2, writing a v6 address on the browser, it'll expand it, but we will hit our address 2:111. And it's hitting VOS3. So let's take a look at these guys. I've done a packet capturing. We'll see how it's getting hit from a v6 only. v2, v3, v2, v3. So here again, a v6 only client is hitting this address, but the load balancer without no NAT64 configured is load balancing on IPv4 web servers. That's your HTTP demo. Now, what if you want to do a TCP, since we have configured TCP? So what I've done is I've configured a script on my Ubuntu client to ignore host check, otherwise the SSH would not work because it checks the host. And since it's load balancing on TCP, when I do SSH on this, it's going to load balance and it's going to get confused that you're getting the same host on the same IPv6 address. You're getting two different host keys, so it does not connect. So I have to ignore that. For that, I wrote a script called SSH no check. And what it does is it does SSH using this parameter saying do not check the host. And I'm SSHing into the IPv6 address here, 2:111. And when I do that, you'll see it's going to connect, it's going to load balance between these two. Again, this is just hacking. You're not going to use this. I'm just trying to demo the fact that IPv6 on it's doing load balancing on HTTP, but it's also going to load balance on TCP without NAT64. And it's talking from v6 to v4. So I'm going to run this script. So it went to v2 now. That's my v2, and you can see the traffic hitting it. I'm going to exit. And now notice this guy. Now I got v3, v2, v3. So it is load balancing not only on HTTP, but also on TCP. No NAT64, and it's doing load balancing on HTTP as well as TCP. So that's the key point. So your first use case is complete. We saw the browser, and then we saw how it did it with the SSH. Notice in the browser, you're going to write it in the brackets, the square brackets, 2:111, okay? All right, let's go to our NAT64 now without load balancing. To do that, we're going to have to move this guy a little up here, but get back to our BIOS. And we're going to say delete load balancing, commit, and then we're going to say load NAT64. Load NAT64. Commit, show, and here's our NAT64. Okay. So NAT64 is configured to listen on 2:96. That's our prefix right here. And so that's a larger prefix, and we're just listening on a specific address /28, 128. And the translation pool is using the 111 address that I configured on the VIOS Ethernet 1. So you'll see Ethernet 2.2.0 right now was going through its default interface 2.0.0.1 to talk to the web server. Now you'll see that it's going to use 2.0.0.111 instead of this one. So we don't have load balancing. We only have NAT64. All right, so let's get into our NAT64. To do NAT64, let's see. I'm trying to move this guy a little in the middle so that's clear. Or maybe move this guy a little bit out so it's more clear. We're going to hit this address, but we're going to hit it with the address that we're trying to reach. So notice how that's going to work. Because again, HTTP rides over TCP. So instead of 111, we're going to hit 2:2:2:2. There you go. See, it's taking 12.0.0.111 as the source now. Let's hit it one more time and it should hit this guy. And you'll see 12.0.0.111. Oh no, so we're hitting 222 specifically, so it's not load balancing, I apologize. So right now it's not load balancing, it's just doing NAT64. So I'm hitting from V6 to V4 web server on a specific address. So that's using the browser. And then obviously the web V4 only client is also hitting the 3 directly because it's not using NAT64. And there's no firewall or anything, okay? So it's hitting V3. All right, so now that's your V6 to V4 server with NAT64. We got the web server hitting. Now let's go hit the third one. We hit the second web server, 222. Let's hit the third one, 333. So hit this guy, we got V3. So you are hitting from V6, both of these two web servers without load balancing. Obviously, it's not getting load balancing. If you have to hit load balancer, you have to configure the load balancer, hit it on this address. But right now, our second use case is just going to NAT64 so that we can specifically hit a server with an address, a V6 address, which is 2, and combine that with a V4 address. And that way you are using your NAT64 to convert this packet and take this source address to talk to these. That was the web part. Let's look at the SSH. SSH is going to look like, let's see if I have, so ping. Now, before we get into SSH, let's ping, because SSH here. Watch this and this guy. Now we're pinging this web server. And that's the use case for NAT64 if you're directly hitting those. We're not load balancing. There it is. And then if you want to ping this guy, 2::333, see how we're mixing V6 with V4. This guy. There you go. All right, now SSH BIOS into 2::222 will take you here. That's it. V2 is hitting this guy. Let's hit 333. It's hitting BIOS 3. The same address. Okay. So that's your use case right now, just to make sure that we can understand how the load balancing features or service can be used to load balance between web servers, and it is also supporting TCP, but you should not be using that with SSH because SSH is not going to work unless you do. Obviously, the use case for SSH is to get into a specific server. So my intention here was just to show you that it was doing both TCP and SSH was the only protocol I could, or client I can use to demonstrate TCP besides SSH. If you disable TCP, SSH is not going to work. Okay, so that is your use cases for web load balancers and NAT64. And with this setup, hope it was useful. Appreciate it. Thank you.